All right, good evening everyone, and welcome to another Seaquest webinar. My name is Cheryl and I'm one of the project coordinators along with Claire, Owen and Abby Crosby. For those of you that don't know, Seaquest Southwest is a citizen science marine recording project run by the Cornwall Wildlife Trust Marine team. Some of the main aims of the project are to engage people with our marine environment, to collect data on our amazing marine wildlife, and in turn all of this will be used to help conserve and better protect our marine environment. The project runs jam-packed annual programme. We have volunteer training days, we have public Seaquest watches. One day of the month we all pick a location and we all meet up at the same place and we go out and we all see what we can see and have a catch up, and it's a really lovely day. And also we run talks like this one this evening. And for more information on the Seaquest Southwest project, you can head to the Cornwall Wildlife Trust website, head to Working at Sea, and you'll find us under there, or you can follow us on Facebook. And tonight we have joining us Dan Jarvis from British Divers Marine Life Rescue. He is the Welfare Development and Field Support Officer and the Area Coordinator for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. He is also the Secretary and Trustee of Cornwall Research Seal Group, and he is also involved in a host of other marine conservation projects and charity work, and he works tirelessly to protect our marine mammals, and we are very, very lucky to have him joining us this evening. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Really weird to be doing this, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much. So, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. I hope you'll find it interesting and informative. So we're going to be talking about cetaceans of the Southwest, of course. I'll just briefly go into a little bit of history, not too heavy, and then we'll have a look at some of the species that we're most likely or perhaps not so likely to see around our coastline here, and also introduce along the way a few of the conservation issues that we face, not just here but around the world with the cetaceans that we have. So to start with, I think there's a little bit of a lag on the slide, so I'll try and pause and let it come up on your screens. So what is a cetacean? Well, these are whales, dolphins and porpoises. All of the species of whales, dolphins and porpoises in the world collectively are known as cetaceans, and they're split into two groups: the Mysticetes, or the baleen whales, like your blue whale and your fin whale, for example, and then you have the Odontocetes, which are the toothed whales, but that of course also includes harbour porpoises, common dolphins and pilot whales, for example, as well. There's around about 88 species globally, 30 of which have been recorded in the UK, which is pretty awesome, and a lot of those, we'll add, have been spotted around the southwest. The number of species globally does fluctuate. There are still new species being identified even today. And unfortunately, of course, on the other side of things, there are species that have gone extinct or are about to go extinct. And the one that's of most concern at the moment is the Keta, which is a species of porpoise found off the coast of Mexico. And unfortunately, there's only around 20 of them left, and it's quite likely that they're not going to see out the end of the next year or two, which is very, very sad, despite all the conservation efforts that have gone in to try to save them. Now, cetaceans are mammals just like us, humans, so they breathe air, they're warm-blooded and suckle their young on milk, and they have common features in that they're streamlined, which makes them much more efficient when they're swimming through the water. They have fins instead of arms and legs, and they have a blowhole on top of their head, which is their nostril, basically. So, a little bit of history. Don't worry, like I say, it's not going to be too heavy, despite all of the names that have just popped up on your screen. If we start at the top left, about 50 million years ago, the first recognised cetacean was called Bycatch, which was found in southern Asia. And sort of bouncing our way left to right, right to left down the screen now, we have Ambulocetus around 49 million years ago, Rhodocetus about 47 million years ago, and Protocetus about 45 million years ago. So in the space of about 5 million years, that land-based Bycatch, or partly land-based Bycatch, was gradually changing and evolving to become entirely aquatic. Now, as we go further down, we have the Basilosaurus, the Dorodon, Gangacetus, Cetatherium, Squalodon, and most recently the Kentriodon. There are many more groups of species outside of the ones that I've illustrated here, but it's just giving you a bit of a clue along with the pictures as to how cetaceans evolved from 50 million years ago to the species that we know today. Now, perhaps rather excitingly, I'm just going to unshare my screen so you can see me, sorry, just for a moment. And hopefully you can see that I actually have a few, I'm not sure if I can bring, Cheryl, I'm not sure if you can bring my screen up, so it's just mine showing, I don't know. But hopefully you can see that we actually have a fossil tooth here from one of those species that I just mentioned. This is about 45 million years old and is from one of the species called Dorodon. So that's a little fossil that I have in my collection here at home. Hopefully you can see that quite well. So it's quite a big, almost dinosaur looking tooth, quite pointy and quite long. And then as we get to our more recent animals, we have this one here, which is from a species called Urinodelphis from about 15 million years ago. And that's like a dolphin tooth that we know today, very similar to a dolphin tooth that we know today. And then, of course, we have some of the other species that have really big teeth. And I should add that this one is a more recent species called a sperm whale. And this is one of its teeth, which is pretty huge. And I will need to note that this has actually been a bit of a family heirloom. So we've had it for many, many years in our family. It was actually from one of my grandparents. And you do these days, anything since the mid-90s does need to be licensed. But if it's from before the 90s, then you don't need a license to have them. So I don't need a license to have this. But if you have any cetacean parts that you wish to have, then you must have a license to have them. So I just need to point that out so nobody reports me. Anyway, I will go back to our presentation now so you can get back to the interesting stuff and not. So we have the blowhole at the top of the animal. It's a nostril on the top of its head. It's got the dorsal fin halfway along its back or partway along its back, which helps stabilize the animal as it swims. The flippers down at the bottom, or its pectoral fins, they can help with directional changes and stability when they're swimming. And then at the back of the animal, you've got the flukes, or its tail, and that's where it gets all its swimming power from. So by moving that up and down, it propels itself through the water. Now, the diagram at the bottom looks really complicated, but we'll make it really, really simple. So at the top of the list of names there, we've got the blowhole. Just below that, we've got the phonic lips, and that's where the noises are made in their head that send noises out into the environment. And that goes out through those red arrows that you can see coming out of the dolphin's head in the diagram. And they go through that sort of almost like a slightly elongated lemon thing, the yellowy looking thing there. And that's a fatty area in its forehead, which we call the melon. Now that helps send the sound out into the environment around the animal as it's traveling along, and it reflects back off objects like the sea floor or boats or fish, for example. And they come back towards the animal, and it can use its ears and it's also its lower jaw, where you see that green arrow coming back in. And that can pick up the vibrations of the echolocation noises they're sending out, and it builds up a picture of the 3D environment around that animal, and that's how they find their way around. And that's just for our Odontocetes, our toothed whales. Our Mysticetes don't have that, actually. They are quite different looking. They're the ones that have those big plates of baleen in their mouths, in their upper jaw, that they use for feeding. And at the bottom you can see a nice little diagram of one of the standard feeding methods that pretty much most of the baleen whales tend to use, which is to just swim along, and they take a really big gulp of water filled with plankton and small fish, the things that they tend to feed on most regularly. And they close their mouth with this huge gulp of water inside, filled with all of this food, and you can see that it can really stretch out. On the top diagram there, you can see they're called ventral pleats. And they can expand out, so it looks like it's got a really big blown up face, and then it strains all of that water through its baleen plates, which are like hairy, very solid, hairy plates that hang down from the upper jaw, and they're what catch all of the plankton, and the animal then swallows it after all the water's been filtered and sieved out. So that's all the heavy stuff. Now we're going to move on to something perhaps a little bit more funny, and that's how to tell a male and a female apart. So everything's hidden inside, I will say. They're very streamlined animals, and everything's very neatly tucked away inside these slits. So hopefully you can see the difference between the female there, as she has the mammary slits either side of her genital slit, and then the male, of course, just has the genital slit there. Now, on to our first species. So we're going to start small and go big as we go through this. The smallest of the species that we see around the southwest of England is the Harbour porpoise. It's also one of our most common cetaceans around the UK as well. Despite that, they're actually really hard to spot because they're quite shy little things. They don't show very well at the surface, and if it's a little bit choppy, they're really, really difficult to spot. They grow to just under 2 meters long. They have a plain dark grey back, no real beak, as you can see from the picture below. A little triangular dorsal fin and rounded little pectoral fins, but that's about it for our little porpoises. They're quite cute little things. I really like porpoises. They're quite underrated as a cetacean species, I think, actually. Bit of an underdog, and I like an underdog, so I've got a bit of a soft spot for them, I guess. So this is the first species to introduce you to. As I say, they're not very easy to spot. They're not very active at the surface. They don't do breaching, which is when they jump out of the water and all of that jazz. They tend to keep to themselves, keep quiet, avoid being interacted with by boats, that sort of thing as well. So they're really lovely to see. They're very quiet little animals, and on a really calm, quiet day as well, if you're fairly close to them on a boat, or even close to the shore, if they come close to the shore, you can actually hear them as they breathe, and they're called puffing pigs in the past as a result of that. So one of the first issues that we're going to tackle tonight is bycatch. Now, this is a particularly big problem here around the southwest of England for various reasons. Now, bycatch is the accidental capture of non-target species in active fishing gear. And it's estimated Harbour porpoise annual bycatch in the UK is, in 2015, is between 12 to 1,500 animals. So that's quite a lot of animals, you know, that's just for gillnet fisheries, not other fisheries like trawlers and so on as well, and just UK vessels too. For common dolphins, which we'll move on to next, for them, it was anywhere between sort of 134 to 905 animals estimated in 2015 that are taken annually as bycatch, unfortunately. So it's a really big issue. It's something that the Cornwall Wildlife Trust and many others have been working on for a really, really long time to gather the evidence, to report to the statutory authorities, and to try and also work with the fishermen on ways to mitigate for this, to try and reduce bycatch. And one of those methods is through the use of pingers. So these are devices attached to nets that emit a noise that alert the porpoise or the dolphin or whatever animal it is, a cetacean species that it is, that there is something there that you should be aware of, and it has been shown to decrease the amount of bycatch. So that's the really good thing, and it is working in partnership with the fishermen to try and find these solutions to these problems, and that's a really good way of working together and finding those solutions to those issues. There are a few things that you guys can do to help as well at home. So you can buy responsibly sourced fish. So there's an app that you can download on your phone called the Good Fish Guide from the Marine Conservation Society. And if you go to the supermarket shopping, you can use that app to look up the sources of the fish that you might be buying, and you can look up whether it's rated as a good, responsible fishery and with good population as well. And there's also the Cornwall Good Seafood Guide. Sorry, the Cornwall Good Seafood Guide, which has been put together by one of Cheryl's colleagues called Matt Slater at the Wildlife Trust over the last few years. And again, if you check out that website, that will give you more advice on some of the local fisheries and species that are being caught and how responsibly and sustainably that they've been sourced as well. You can also look out for the Marine Stewardship Council, the MSC logo, on fish that you're buying at supermarkets as well, particularly on tins, and that can give you a good idea that that fish has been sourced responsibly. You can avoid things like farmed salmon because many of the salmon farms are known to shoot pest species, which include things like seals, unfortunately. So it's good to try and avoid that again and find responsibly sourced fish. And buy local as well, because this will link into something that we come on to later, which is climate change. But by buying local, you're reducing the sources of the food coming from the other side of the world, which burns lots of fossil fuels and other things like that, and contributes to global warming and the climate change problem as well. So by buying local, it reduces that problem too. So our next species is the common dolphin. Gets to about 2.5 meters long, and again is one of our most common species that we have here in this country, of course, as the name suggests. They have a dark grey and black back, and then a tan and light grey hourglass sort of shape and pattern along their body, going head to tail, that you can hopefully see in the photo and the picture at the bottom. They've got a fairly long beak. They've got what we call a falcate, which is just the fancy word for hooked dorsal fin, quite pointed pectoral fins, and they can be really active at the surface. If they're around close to the shore, if you're on a good watch point, you can see them from quite some distance because they do make quite a bit of a splash. They can be pretty obvious at the surface. They tend to be quite fast moving as well, very excitable animals. So the next issue that we're going to explore briefly is underwater noise. So cetaceans, of course, are particularly the ones that echolocate, our odontocetes. They're really sensitive to acoustic or noise under the water, disrupting their ability to navigate and to communicate with each other, for example. So sources of this noise can include acoustic surveying, industrial activity such as seabed mining perhaps, marine renewable installations when they're being built, like wind farms being driven into the seabed, shipping and other watercraft on a more smaller scale as well. And one of the other big ones is actually military activity. So sonar is really the big one, as well as explosives being used underwater or close to the water. Now, this can lead to temporary or permanent levels of what we call threshold shift, or basically just deafness. Again, it's just another fancy term. Which can cause them discomfort and disorientation, disruption to communication and navigation, as I mentioned already, and also something known as gas bubble disease, which is basically the same as the bends which divers get if they come to the surface too quickly. So if there's a whale or a dolphin that's been underwater for some time and they hear this noise that startles them, it might cause them to rise more rapidly than their body can respond, and they get this gas bubble disease problem as well, which unfortunately can actually also lead to their death as well, or becoming live stranded. Now, back in 2008, we actually had the UK's largest mass stranding of common dolphins take place around Falmouth Bay. And you just, I'll just flick back. Hopefully you can see on this map just here, the epicenter is near St Mawes at a place called Froe in a little creek. And then the other crosses you can see on there are locations that had animals stranded or in danger. So there was actually almost 100 animals involved in this incident. There were 24 that were found dead early in the morning, unfortunately, after the tide had gone out already. But there were still quite a few that were stranded alive, and there was a huge response from the British Divers Marine Life Rescue Team and the emergency services, who all worked together and made a fantastic effort to try and rescue the survivors. And around 70 dolphins were actually rescued that day. Some of them were still stranded, but there was a heck of a lot more in different places around the bay that had come into shallow water, up into creeks, and just couldn't find their way back out. And obviously something quite major had happened. And it was in the investigation that followed that it was identified that an international military exercise that was happening offshore at that time was the most likely cause of what made these animals act and behave as they did, and resulted in this huge stranding. And although it was a really sad incident because of what did happen, it did have some positives as well, in that we do at BDMLR pretty much have the red telephone to the Royal Navy headquarters. If we do get incidents like this or near misses of this type in future, we can give them a ring and ask them whatever it is that they're doing, could they stop and let the animals get back out? And it has worked. We've trialed it and it's been used in real life and it has worked. So it's built up a really, really good relationship with them. Our next species is, it's actually one that we don't see very often, but we do tend to see strandings of most years here in the southwest. This is the striped dolphin, easily confused with the common dolphin. It's a very similar size and shape, except it doesn't have that hourglass pattern. Instead, it's got a couple of streaks that run, stripes, sorry, that run from its eye down towards the rear end of its body, and another one that goes from its eye down to its pectoral fin as well. So that's the easiest way to tell it apart. Otherwise, it looks really, really similar in its appearance. It's got that long beak, the hooked dorsal fin, pointed pectoral fins, and again, it's super active at the surface. Very, very often seen doing lots of breaching, sometimes even spins in the air. I've seen them do that in the Bay of Biscay, and it's just amazing how active they are at the surface. The next issue that we're going to look at is climate change. I mentioned this briefly earlier on. So this is the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from human activity that is causing the warming of the planet, and this is having lots and lots of knock-on effects in lots of different ways. And these include, but are not limited to, warmer air and sea temperatures, which can then in turn lead to ice melting at the North and South Pole and of glaciers like in Greenland and Canada and other places like that. This in turn, of course, can lead to sea level rise and increased precipitation, so rain, snow, that sort of thing as well. That can lead on, in turn, to more extreme weather events. And something that we seem to be seeing more of here, specifically around southwest England, are more storms in winter coming in off the Atlantic. For me, having been involved with British Divers Marine Life Rescue for nearly 20 years now here in Cornwall, it's certainly something that I've noticed since around 2013-14. Since that winter, they've mostly been much worse than what's gone before, with lots more bigger storms, more severe storms coming in more frequently, and this is something that could continue into the future, unfortunately. And while it might not affect the cetaceans as much, another of our brilliant species that we have here around the southwest, our seals, are hugely affected by this, as the storms usually start to come in at the beginning of their pupping season, and it's causing huge amounts of problems at that time of the year for them. So it can displace species, it can cause much more increased mortality or deaths of animals of certain species as well. And it can also in turn lead to extinctions for some of those species that are in a really delicate state with their population. And we're not just talking marine species. It's seabirds, land birds, and also insects and other things like that as well. So it's all across the board. It affects everybody and everything. And it is something that it really does need everybody to be a part of the solution, not just leave it to government policies or certain businesses to pick up the slack because they're the worst or what have you. It is something that we all contribute to in some little way. It doesn't matter how small, but there are lots of little things that we can do to try and rectify that and mitigate that. So using less fossil fuels. So there's a big move now towards electric cars to get away from petrol and diesel. More renewable sources of energy as well, which is fantastic. So you can even check your energy providers as well. There's certain ones out there that will only use energy sourced from renewables rather than from fossil fuels like coal or oil. Buy local again, decrease food waste, reduce, reuse, recycle, of course. We're going to drum that into you tonight. That's going to come up again later. Educate others as well about all of these issues. People might not think it's something that affects them, but actually it is going to affect them at some point in their life, whether it's today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, or 200 years from now. Something that we can do today to help slow this down will have a noticeable effect, but it needs everybody to come together and work together on finding where we can do better. And something that we hope that will come out of our current situation is that we go towards having greener solutions towards businesses and industries and other things like that as well. So there's a big push on that at the moment as we sort of almost start to get out the other side of this coronavirus situation. Now, our next species that we're going to illustrate is the white-beaked dolphin. It's not seen very often here around southwest England, but there is a notable little population of them off Lyme Bay, so sort of between Devon, Dorset and the Isle of Wight. It's currently being studied by a research organisation to try and identify exactly how many animals might be in this population, but they have been known to wander further west, and we have had a couple of sightings last year of these guys in Cornwall off the south coast, which is fantastic. So they're not something that we'll see very often, but it's very exciting to know that they're here, and they're one of the most southerly known populations of this species. They're usually found sort of up in the northern North Sea off the top of Scotland and up that way. So for there to be a little population down here that's possibly completely isolated from the rest of the population is really, really important for us to do some conservation work on them. Now they're quite a bit bigger. They're up to around 3 meters or so. They've got a sort of a mottled grey and black back with white and grey patches on the sides, and they have quite a short snout or beak as well, which is usually white as well, of course, where they get their name from. They're not as active as perhaps common and striped dolphins are, but they still can be, Another issue, of course, we're going to talk about overfishing, so the unsustainable targeted fishing of a particular location and or a species, and this reduces the availability of prey for other animals in that particular area or that feed on particular species, which can in turn destabilize food webs, and they can take a really long time to recover as well. So again, just to reiterate, some of the things that you guys can all do as individuals and families to help is to buy responsibly, use that Good Fish Guide app from the MCS or the Cornwall Good Seafood Guide website as well to help you with sourcing the most responsibly and sustainably sourced fish at the supermarket or the shops or wherever you go to get your food from. Look out for that Marine Stewardship Council logo, avoid farm salmon again for the reasons that I mentioned before, and once more, buy local again to help with that climate change problem too. Our next species is quite a different looking one. This is the Risso's dolphin. Again, quite a bit bigger, almost 4 meters now. They generally are quite a plain greyish colour, particularly when they're younger, with a white underside. But as they get older, particularly with males, who tend to fight with each other and scrape each other with their teeth, leaving these marks that look like a rake has been dragged across them, which of course we call rake marks, they do gradually turn white. So with these guys, if you're lucky enough to see them, you might be able to spot that some of the animals might have a lot more scars and be much whiter because of those scars, and they generally will be the older animals and probably the largest animals in that group as well. So that's a really neat little thing that you can do if you ever do see them. They've got a really big blunt head and a big fat melon. They're pretty big chunky animals, really robust, and quite a tall dorsal fin as well. They can be somewhat active at the surface, but they're also known to be a bit lazy, and they'll just lie at the surface quite quietly resting. And obviously it's a really good idea to leave them alone if that's what they're doing. Now, disturbance from us humans, unfortunately, is a really big problem these days, and it is something that's increasing around the country. There's lots more different activities like coast steering and paddle boards, and there's a lot more operators that are going out looking for wildlife as well. So we need to make sure that our interactions with wildlife is on their terms and not ours, because if we're doing everything on our terms, which is really, really selfish anyway, it's the animals that are suffering as a result. So the overriding message is to give animals space and time, and you can look up on the website link that you can see there for the Cornwall Marine and Coastal Code Group. There's guidelines on there, codes of conduct, that will give you lots and lots of details on how to do best practice behaviour around our marine wildlife, not just cetaceans, but basking sharks, seabirds, seals as well, to look for all these little cues that might tell you that they're not happy with you being where you are and that you need to back off or stop whatever it is that you're doing that might be upsetting them. So disturbance incidents that you do witness, this is specific for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, I should add, they can be reported to the Cornwall Wildlife Trust Marine Strandings Network hotline on that phone number that you can see there, 0345 201 2626, and they get logged and followed up by a coalition of groups that run the Cornwall Marine and Coastal Code Group that includes the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, Devon and Cornwall Police Wildlife Crime Officers, the Council, British Divers Marine Life Rescues in there, as well as a whole host of other people and organisations as well, who will review these cases and review the data and can take action where it's appropriate. Of course, if it's a much more serious incident, you can report things directly to the police and they can, again, follow those up on their terms too. When it comes to cetaceans, all species in the UK are protected from intentional or reckless disturbance. So it doesn't matter if you don't know what the law is, you're still subject to it. So ignorance isn't an excuse. Now, our next species is the bottlenose dolphin, quite an iconic one for us here in the southwest. Hopefully some of you might have caught a talk by Sean Acor a couple of weeks ago that talked specifically about the resident pod that we have here around the southwest of England, and it is the only resident pod in England as well. So they're really, really important to try and conserve. There's only around 30 or so in this local group that we have around our inshore waters. They're really big animals, up to around 4 meters long, pretty plain grey on the back and sides, and then changing to white underneath. They have quite a short, chunky beak as well. Really big fins that are quite obvious, and these are the ones, it's flipper basically. They're very active at the surface, do lots of tumbling and sort of somersaults and lots of play behavior. They do come quite close to the shore as well, so sometimes they can be really obvious, and let's not underestimate how big these creatures are. Even if you're watching them from a distance from the shore, you can get the impression of how big they are, but they can weigh about 500 kilos, you know, a small car is pretty huge. And, you know, they're pretty powerful creatures, so you do have to respect that too. Now, bottlenose dolphins, quite interestingly, are known to attack other cetacean species, especially harbour porpoises. And it's still not entirely clear why they do this. It's certainly not predation, as the bodies have not that we find in the Strandings network have never had any signs of predation on them, but certainly a lot of injuries, broken ribs, ruptured organs, you know, it can get quite nasty. And you can see on the photo in the bottom right that there's all these rake marks again in this case on a harbour porpoise that have been made by bottlenose dolphins. And we know it's them because of the spacing between the rake marks there. So bottlenose dolphins' tooth spacing is about 11 millimetres, and if you put a tape measure against them, you'll see that it's about 11 millimetres between those rakes there. There have also occasionally been witnessed incidents, and that's what you can see in the top photo as well. It's very rare that incidents are witnessed, but we do find a number of bodies every year, as I say, mostly of harbour porpoises around our coast. The other issue that I'm going to bring up here, this is a bit of a double-headed issue actually, is a bit specific to bottlenose dolphins, but it's not entirely limited to them, is we sometimes get individuals that are known as social solitary animals. And these are animals that for whatever reason have ended up by themselves, whether they've left their pod by choice or have been rejected for some reason, and then they don't seem to rejoin another group and end up on their own. And sometimes these animals start to seek out human interaction for whatever reason. And we've had a few of these quite notable individuals over the years visiting the southwest. One of them recently has been Splashy around Cornwall. There's been Clet, who some of you might have known or heard of, who visited probably about 9 years ago, eight years ago or so now, and was around for quite some time. And for those of you with long enough memories, we had another few back in the mid-2000s. There was a pair called Cookie and Sleeky, and another one called George, who was a wanderer from France and has been in other parts of Europe as well. And these animals can get themselves into a spot of bother quite often, particularly ones like George, who is the one that you can see in the photo at the bottom with all the boats surrounding him, not a life jacket in sight, of course. And they do seek out human interaction. As I say, they'll come into harbours, they'll follow boats, they will do some really quite unusual behaviours, and this can really put them at risk because quite often these animals end up being hit by boat propellers, which then leaves them injured and open to infection, potentially even killed, unfortunately, as well as getting entangled in pot lines or mooring ropes, that sort of thing as well, because they're coming much closer to them to interact when normally they wouldn't. So again, that's another sort of issue that mainly sort of we at British Divers Marine Life Rescue and the Marine Connection and others try to deal with when they come up. Now, getting bigger, we have the pilot whale next. They get up to around 6 meters long, really dark grey, almost black body with a white chest patch. They don't have a beak, so they do look quite similar to the Risso's dolphin. Quite a chunky dorsal fin though, they're really noticeable. And it's set quite far forward on the body, and they have really long pectoral fins. They can be somewhat inactive at the surface as well. They can be a bit lazy and just be resting and not very active at all. Now, pilot whales you might know as one of the species that strands en masse alive in places like New Zealand and Australia and South Africa. But it actually happens here as well in the UK, and over the last 10 years or so we've had a number of these mass strandings up in Scotland mostly. Although in the distant past we have had 2 cases of this in Cornwall. The first one was actually in 1911 in Penzance, and there was around 50 pilot whales that stranded alive. And this in turn actually led to the beginnings of the National Recording Scheme for Stranded Cetaceans at the Natural History Museum, and that began in 1913. So that's a little Cornwall claim to fame, is that incident that happened in Cornwall is what started the National Recording Scheme as we know it today, the Cetacean Strandings Investigation Programme. Now, there's various reasons why animals could get life stranded. It might be that they're ill or injured. They might just simply make a mistake because they're close inshore, don't realise the tides, or they're in an enclosed area like an estuary or near a harbour, for example, and get caught out by that. Sometimes it might just be a simple case of an aged animal coming to the end of its natural life, or it could be the very young animals that are still dependent on their mum, and for whatever reason they've gotten separated from her and can't fend for themselves. And then of course we have our mass strandings, which is usually caused by one individual that there's a problem with, and that others try to come to help and all end up getting stuck on the beach. Live stranded cetaceans should always be reported immediately to British Divers Marine Life Rescue on the 24-hour hotline number that you can see there, so 01825 765546. And then we'll get volunteers out who are trained to deal with these, along with vets, to assist the animal and help make decisions about how to rescue it. Moving on to our largest whales now, we're not far off done, I'm just a little bit aware of time now. The Minke whale is our most common baleen whale, getting up to around 8.5 meters long. It has a grey back and a white underside like most of the baleen whales do, but particular to the Minke whale, on their pectoral fins, they have this little white stripe, and none of the other species have this, it's only them. So it's a really good way to identify them if you get a pretty good look. Now, if you do get a good look, you're very, very lucky, because although they're relatively common around our coast, they're still not that easy to pick out sometimes, particularly, again, if it's a bit choppy, as although despite their size, they're not very active at the surface. You know, they're not often seen breaching or anything like that. It's just, as you can sort of see in the photo there, a back and a little tiny fin popping up at the surface, and that might be all you see of the animal. So they can hide pretty well. Take it from me, I've had experience of that and totally missed them when other people have seen them looking in the right direction at the right time. Now, pollution, of course, we know is a really big issue for our marine wildlife, not just cetaceans. Ingestion of things like plastic bags can cause the blockages of digestive tracts, can lead to infections and things like that as well. Toxins that collect on litter that is ingested, or even through food chains. So little creatures, plankton or small fish that eat little bits of litter that are then eaten by something bigger than they are, that are eaten by something bigger than they are, that then end up in a dolphin or a whale, for example. They accumulate up to those top predators, our apex predators. So again, dolphins, whales, seals, those sorts of things. But then they don't get passed on anywhere else, and they just sit there stored in those animals' tissues. And once those toxins get to high enough levels, they can affect their reproductive and immune systems. And the photo at the bottom that you can see there is an animal that is from our west coast population here in the UK off Scotland. This animal actually washed up a few years ago, and when the scientists tested her PCB levels, her polychlorinated biphenyls, that's one of the pollutants, it was found to be the highest level on record for any species of animal anywhere in the world. It was around 950 parts per million, where it's known to have toxic effects at around 60 parts per million. It's absolutely incredible the amount of toxins that are built up in this animal. And something that's really worrying is that our west coast population of killer whales, which is our only completely resident pod of killer whales in the UK, have been known to not have had a calf in around 25 years. So there aren't many of them left now. I think there's only 7 or 8 of them left now. So based on that and what we know from this stranded animal here, it's quite likely that they don't have an ability to reproduce, and they are almost certainly going to become extinct in our lifetime, I'm afraid to say. It's really sad news for these guys. And that, again, is really good motivation for stuff that we can do to try and stop this from happening. So we can stop using plastics first and foremost. There's a huge push on this over the last few years. You can't have missed it, hopefully. So try and use alternatives to plastics. Dispose of chemicals responsibly. Don't just tip them down the drain. It'll end up in the sea at some point. Take part in beach, river and street cleans, whether it's as an organised event or just by yourself if you're out for a walk with the dog. And dispose of rubbish in a responsible way means that hopefully it won't get back to the sea. 80% of marine litter actually comes from the land, not from the sea. So it's a huge amount that's coming off our streets, coming through our rivers, and eventually finding its way into the ocean. And again, of course, the old mantra: reduce, reuse, recycle. Now, our next very exciting cetacean species is the humpback whale, and I'm really pleased to say it's great news for these guys because their population appears to be recovering in recent years, and in the last few years, certainly, we seem to be seeing more and more of them here around the southwest of England. And hopefully this is a sign of them coming back to places that they used to live 100 to 300 years ago, before hunting and whaling activities sort of moved them away from our areas and reduced their population too much. They're pretty huge animals, up to 15 meters long. They're pretty identifiable as well because they tend to be active at the surface. They have that little humped dorsal fin as well, which is quite different from the Minke whale and other baleen whale species. And they have those huge pectoral fins as well. And the photo that you've got here is an incredible encounter that quite a few people that we know had off the south coast near Mounts Bay last year, where there was a humpback whale in the summer lunge feeding at the surface for ages, feeding on a huge ball of fish. So that was a pretty amazing encounter. Now, entanglement is actually an issue that really affects humpback whales, actually, as well as a few other of the larger cetacean species. It's the accidental capture of any species in marine litter, and that includes any lost or discarded fishing gear, as well as anything else. It could be plastic packaging bands, or rope or other stuff like that as well, not necessarily from fishing. And it's estimated that around 100,000 marine mammals are killed per year globally as a result of entanglement. And again, there's a couple of things you can do to try and help with this, which is keep our streets, our rivers, our beaches and our oceans clean by taking part in beach clean activities. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Again, the less that we throw away, the less waste ends up in landfill and potentially ending up getting into the ocean in some way at some point too. BDMLR also has a large whale disentanglement team who are specially trained to respond to these around the UK. And last October, they were successful in disentangling the individual that you can see in these two photos here up in Orkney. The last species that we're going to look at properly is the fin whale. It's the second largest animal in the world after the blue whale, but it's pretty much the largest that we're going to get here in the UK. Gets up to around 26 meters long, humongous animals. Plain grey body pretty much, little dorsal fin, much like the Minke whale. Doesn't have those white stripes on its pectoral fins, of course, but again, if you do get a good enough look at them, other than their size, you might be able to identify them from the colouring on their head. So one side, the left side, is usually grey, and the right-hand side is usually white, and that's an adaptation to their feeding behaviour to help camouflage them. They're not particularly active creatures at the surface, but because of their size, if there's one around, you're usually going to see that huge blow that you can see, such as the one in the photo. Now, whaling is a really big issue that's been going on for many, many years now, and there's still a few countries that carry out whaling activities like Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands as well, and Japan are also known for drive hunts of dolphins, where they herd a pod of dolphins or small whales into an enclosed area close to the shore and go into the water and take them all. Unfortunately, this is still a big problem in some parts of the world, such as those that I've mentioned here, but there has been a bit of good news recently, as one of the last whaling operators in Iceland has announced that they're not going out to do any more whaling. They're closing down, and that leaves only one business left in Iceland that's still potentially able to go out and carry out whaling activities. So there's a little bit of a win there. That was just last week that was announced, so it's a nice bit of good news, and hopefully, over time these things will stop completely, because for places like Iceland, it isn't an ancestral activity or something like that. It's not part of their heritage. It is actually a commercial industry. There is also concern over the captive dolphin industry around the world, because some of the drive hunts, particularly in Japan, have been documented to involve people from certain captive facilities who go over to pick out dolphins to take back with them to their facilities to have a life in captivity as well. So, of course, not supporting those facilities means that they will have to review their practices and hopefully stop them at some point in the future. There's been some good documentaries on this in recent years as well, which have had a really big impact on this issue too. And there are things that you can do as well, such as you yourself avoiding captive cetacean facilities and signing petitions against these activities, as well as the hunting and whaling as well, to try and help get governments and policymakers to listen and to take action. Now, we do have a few occasional visitors to our shores. We have the killer whale or orca. We do occasionally get sightings, maybe once every 2 or 3 years or so, although we still don't seem to have managed any decent photos of them, but they are out there somewhere. Below that, we have the sperm whale. This is a huge animal. It's usually found really far offshore, nowhere near the coastlines, so it is really unusual and perhaps worrying if you did see them around our coastline. Below that is the sei whale, very similar to the fin whale, not quite as large, but has a much bigger dorsal fin. On the other side of the screen there, we've got 3 species of beaked whale, the sowerbeers, the cuviers, and the northern bottlenose whales there. And again, similar to the sperm whale, they're far offshore, nowhere near the coast. So if you saw one of these close to the coast, I'd be worried. I'd be calling BDMLR because it would be concerning that they're so close in. We do have a few unusual records to finish with as well. This is my last slide. We're just about finished now. Back in the early 2000s, this was a pygmy sperm whale that stranded alive in Devon at Thurlestone. I think it was about 2001 or 2002, this guy. Unfortunately, didn't survive. It was in a really poor state of health. It's basically a miniature version of a sperm whale that's similar in size to a Harbour porpoise, actually. But you can see it's quite an unusual looking creature, very, very distinctive. This was in 2003. This is actually a sowerbeers beaked whale that live stranded at Pra Sands down in Mounts Bay. Unfortunately, it was already dead when it was found, but the post-mortem examination found that it had stranded while it was still alive. This here is an Atlantic white-sided dolphin, and this is actually on my local beach. I live just down in Hale in St Ives Bay, and this is almost about as close as you can get to my house from the beach, which is about half a mile away or so. And this one stranded alive in 2008, unfortunately in a really poor state of health. It's a species that's normally found quite far in the north, sort of off the top of Scotland, Shetland, further north than that. So it's really, really unusual to get them this far down. And I think, to my knowledge, this is the last record that we had for southwest England, and that was in 2008. Then we have this little guy here, which is a dwarf sperm whale, and this guy actually stranded alive in Penzance at the back of the train station in 2012, and it got back into the water and it did eventually swim off, but this is actually the first record of this species for the UK, which is really, really exciting. This is a bit of a messy one to look at, I'm afraid, so I'm sorry about that. This is a Blainville's beaked whale, so this has only ever been recorded in the UK once before in Wales back in the 90s, and this very decomposed example was actually found stranded in Mounts Bay in 2013 or 2014, I think it was. We have then in 2016 this small lump near St Michael's Mount. This is actually a bowhead whale. This was the second ever record for the UK. The first one was actually just the year before off the Isles of Scilly. And we've had one more record since then, so that was quite exciting. I actually had the privilege of getting to see this one as it was really close to the shore and it was called in to BDMLR, and we went down to check it out and we spent ages being worried about it and also sort of wondering what it was before we identified it successfully. But it was absolutely fine. It swam off after about 2.5 hours or so, and we didn't need to have worried about it, which is great. It was a lovely sighting. This next picture that we have here is a sperm whale. So, as I mentioned, quite unusual. It did strand alive at Perranporth in 2016 and passed away pretty quickly, unfortunately. It was really, really poorly. But the exciting thing about this one that was so notable was it's the first record of a female in the UK, we've only ever had males before, as the females tend to stay in the tropics with their calves, and it's only the males that migrate north to cold temperate waters. So this is our first ever female sperm whale for the UK here in Cornwall 4 years ago. Now, just a few weeks ago, right before lockdown was imposed on us, I actually attended this carcass here for the Wildlife Trust's Marine Strandings Network, and this was actually a Cuvier's beaked whale in the end. It's very, very manky, so apologies for those of you who might be having dinner or might just be about to have dinner, but this is sort of the thing that we do deal with in the Marine Strandings Network, to record animals like this, take samples, photographs and measurements for the national database. And then finally, to end on a happy note, last year, a wildlife watching operator off Padstow spotted this. It was a huge animal with a really tall dorsal fin. It was a sei whale, hooray! First one that's been seen for a while here around the southwest of England, but this one was alive and kicking off the coast last summer, looking really, really healthy. So that was our final unusual record that I'll mention, and I'll finish up now. Just to say, your sightings data is really, really important. You can see on the little list here places that you can report your sightings to. There's an amazing app that you can download for animals in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly on your phone. So there and then, if you see something, you can just tap in a few little bits of data and that gets recorded. And this is really, really useful information that can be used. There's also Seaquest Southwest, which runs regular public sea watch sessions around Cornwall, so keep an eye out for dates and locations of those, and you can take part too. And if you do find anything that has washed ashore dead, any marine wildlife can be reported to the Marine Strandings Network if you're in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. For other parts of England, there's the Cetacean Strandings Investigation Programme on the number at the bottom there. And that's me finished. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope it's been interesting, and I'll pass back to Claire now, and hopefully we might have a couple of minutes for questions or so before the clap for carers.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was really great and really, really interesting. We don't really have much time left for questions, but I think the best thing to do would probably be, if you do have any questions for Dan, just give us an email at Seaquest. So it's seaquest@cornwallwildlifetrust.org.uk.